Sarah Martinez never expected her quiet Tuesday evening at the downtown coffee shop to turn into a nightmare. She sat in the corner booth, grading papers from her high school English class, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. To anyone watching, she looked like just another teacher finishing her work after a long day. The coffee shop was nearly empty except for a few college students hunched over their laptops and an elderly man reading his newspaper. Sarah enjoyed these peaceful moments, sipping her chai latte while red ink flowed across student essays. Teaching had become her passion after leaving her previous career, and she found genuine joy in helping teenagers discover their potential. 3 men entered the shop around 8:30, their heavy boots echoing against the wooden floor. They were loud, rowdy, and clearly intoxicated. The barista, a young woman named Emma who couldn't have been older than 19, glanced nervously towards Sarah as the men approached the counter. "Give us 3 black coffees." "Sweetheart," the tallest man demanded, his voice slurred and aggressive. His companions snickered behind him, making crude comments about Emma's appearance. The girl's hands shook as she prepared their order, clearly uncomfortable with their behavior. Sarah looked up from her papers, observing the situation carefully. She had learned long ago to read people and assess threats quickly. These men weren't just drunk. They were looking for trouble. Their body language, the way they positioned themselves around the counter, and their increasing volume suggested they wanted confrontation. When Emma handed them their coffee, the leader grabbed her wrist roughly. "You're pretty cute, aren't you? Why don't you come with us when you get off work?" Emma tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. Her face went pale as she struggled to free herself. "Please let me go," Emma whispered, tears forming in her eyes. The other customers in the shop pretended not to notice, burying their faces deeper in their books and laptops. Nobody wanted to get involved. Sarah set down her red pen and watched as the situation escalated. The man's friends encouraged his behavior, laughing as Emma became more distressed. They blocked her path behind the counter, preventing her from seeking help from her manager in the back room. "Come on, baby. Don't be shy," the man continued, his grip on Emma's wrist becoming painful. "We just want to show you a good time." His breath reeked of alcohol as he leaned closer to the terrified girl. Sarah had seen enough. She closed her gradebook calmly and stood up from her booth. Her movements were controlled and deliberate as she walked toward the counter. Years of training had taught her to remain composed in dangerous situations, even when her instincts screamed for immediate action. "Excuse me," Sarah said politely, her voice steady and clear. "I think the young lady asked you to let her go." She positioned herself near the group, her stance casual but ready. The men turned to look at her, surprised by the interruption. The leader released Emma's wrist and faced Sarah with a sneer. "Mind your own business, lady. This doesn't concern you." He was at least 6 inches taller than Sarah and probably outweighed her by 60 pounds. His friends flanked him, creating an intimidating wall of muscle and aggression. Sarah smiled calmly. "Actually, it does concern me. You're making everyone in here uncomfortable, and you're clearly making this young woman afraid. Why don't you just finish your coffee and leave peacefully?" The men exchanged glances and burst into laughter. "Oh, look, guys, we got ourselves a hero," the leader mocked. "What are you going to do about it, Teach? Give us detention?" His friends found this hilarious, their laughter echoing through the nearly empty coffee shop. Emma used the distraction to step back toward the safety of the back room, but the men quickly refocused their attention on Sarah. They saw her as an easy target, a middle-aged teacher who had foolishly inserted herself into a dangerous situation. "Listen, lady," the second man said, stepping closer to Sarah. "You better walk away right now before you get hurt. We're not in the mood for games." His tone carried a clear threat, and his fists clenched at his sides. Sarah remained perfectly still, her expression unchanged. She had faced far worse opponents than these 3 bullies, though they had no way of knowing that. To them, she was just another civilian who didn't understand the reality of violence. The coffee shop fell silent except for the soft jazz music playing overhead. The other customers held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Emma stood frozen behind the counter, her phone in her hand but too scared to call for help. The leader took another step toward Sarah, invading her personal space in an obvious attempt to intimidate her. "Last chance, Teach. Walk away or we'll make you walk away." His threat hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was about to spread. Sarah looked up at him with calm, steady eyes. "I don't think that's going to happen," she said quietly. Her voice carried a confidence that seemed completely at odds with the situation. She was outnumbered 3-1 by men who were larger, younger, and clearly prepared for violence. The men laughed again, but this time their laughter had an edge to it. Something about Sarah's demeanor was different from what they expected. Most people would have backed down by now, but she stood her ground with an almost unsettling composure. "All right then," the leader said, cracking his knuckles. "Don't say we didn't warn you." He raised his hand as if to grab Sarah's shoulder, confident that one touch would send her running. After all, what could one middle-aged teacher possibly do against 3 strong men? Sarah watched his hand move toward her with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the encounter. Inside, muscle memory and years of intensive training were awakening, preparing her body for what was about to happen. The men had no idea they were about to discover just how wrong their assumptions could be. The moment the man's hand reached for Sarah's shoulder, everything changed. In one fluid motion, she caught his wrist, twisted it sharply, and used his own momentum to send him crashing into the nearby table. Coffee cups scattered across the floor as the man groaned in pain, clutching his twisted arm. His 2 friends stood frozen for a split second, their brains struggling to process what had just happened. Their leader, who moments before had been intimidating a helpless teacher, was now on the ground looking dazed and confused. "What the hell?" the second man shouted, lunging towards Sarah with his fists raised. He was younger and faster than his friend, but Sarah was ready. She sidestepped his clumsy punch, grabbed his extended arm, and used a simple but effective joint lock to bring him to his knees. The third man, seeing his companions quickly defeated, reached into his jacket. Sarah's eyes immediately locked onto his movement, and she recognized the familiar outline of a concealed weapon. Her training kicked into overdrive as years of combat experience flooded back. Before the man could fully draw whatever he was reaching for, Sarah closed the distance between them in 2 quick steps. She struck his wrist with a precise blow that numbed his entire arm, then swept his legs out from under him. He hit the floor hard, his head striking the edge of a chair on the way down. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds. 3 men who had entered the coffee shop looking for trouble now lay groaning on the floor, completely incapacitated by someone they had dismissed as an easy target. Emma stood behind the counter with her mouth hanging open, her phone still in her trembling hands. The other customers stared in stunned silence, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. The elderly man with the newspaper had even lowered it to get a better look at the scene. Sarah straightened her blouse and walked calmly back to her table, stepping over one of the groaning men. She picked up her red pen and returned to grading papers as if nothing had happened. Her hands were perfectly steady as she wrote comments in the margins of student essays. "Should I call the police?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She was still processing the fact that her quiet English teacher had just single-handedly defeated 3 aggressive men without breaking a sweat. "That would probably be a good idea," Sarah replied without looking up from her papers. "They might want to hear about what happened here tonight." She continued grading, marking a particularly well-written paragraph with an encouraging comment. The first man struggled to sit up, holding his twisted wrist against his chest. "You crazy woman. You could have killed us," he accused, his voice filled with pain and disbelief. The confidence and aggression from earlier had completely evaporated. Sarah glanced up from her work with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the encounter. "I could have," she agreed matter-of-factly. "But I didn't. You should probably think about that." Her words carried a weight that made all 3 men fall silent. Within minutes, the coffee shop filled with the sound of approaching sirens. Emma had given the dispatcher a detailed account of what had happened, though she struggled to explain exactly how one woman had managed to subdue 3 attackers so efficiently. 2 police officers entered the shop, their hands resting casually on their weapons as they surveyed the scene. They saw 3 men on the floor in various stages of recovery and 1 woman calmly grading papers in the corner booth. "Ma'am, we received a report of an altercation here," the senior officer said, approaching Sarah's table. "Can you tell us what happened?" He was a veteran cop who had seen his share of bar fights and domestic disputes, but this scene was unlike anything in his experience. Sarah set down her pen and looked up at the officer. "These 3 men were harassing the barista. When I asked them to stop, they threatened me and attempted to assault me. I defended myself." Her explanation was calm and precise, delivered without emotion or embellishment. The officer looked from Sarah to the three men, trying to piece together how events had unfolded. "You did this?" he asked, gesturing toward the groaning attackers. "All three of them?" His tone suggested he was having trouble believing the evidence before his eyes. "Yes," Sarah replied simply. "They left me no choice." She returned to her grading, underlining a particularly creative metaphor in one student's essay. The normalcy of her behavior contrasted sharply with the chaos surrounding her. Emma stepped forward, her voice gaining strength as she recounted the events. "Those men grabbed me and wouldn't let go. They were drunk and saying horrible things. When Sarah asked them to leave me alone, they threatened to hurt her. She was just trying to protect me." The police officers took statements from all the witnesses, including the college students and the elderly man with the newspaper. Every account corroborated Emma's story. The three men had been the aggressors, and Sarah had acted in self-defense. As the paramedics checked the injured men for serious wounds, the lead officer returned to Sarah's table. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come to the station to fill out some paperwork. This is quite a situation we have here." He was clearly puzzled by the entire incident. Sarah closed her gradebook and gathered her papers. "Of course, officer. I understand you have procedures to follow." She stood up and reached for her purse, moving with the same controlled grace she had displayed during the confrontation. The first attacker, now sitting in a chair with his wrist in a makeshift sling, stared at Sarah with a mixture of fear and confusion. "Who are you, lady? What kind of teacher knows how to fight like that?" His question echoed what everyone in the coffee shop was thinking. Sarah paused at the door and looked back at him. "The kind who believes in protecting people who can't protect themselves," she said quietly. Then she walked out into the night, leaving behind a room full of people who would never forget what they had witnessed. As she got into the police car for the ride to the station, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed since leaving the military. Teaching high school English was supposed to be peaceful and predictable, but sometimes, she thought with a slight smile, the past had a way of catching up with the present. At the police station, Detective Mike Rodriguez had seen the preliminary reports from the coffee shop incident, but he still couldn't quite believe what he was reading. 3 men hospitalized by one middle-aged schoolteacher? It seemed impossible, yet the evidence was undeniable. Sarah sat across from him in the interview room, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She had answered every question with the same measured precision she had shown at the coffee shop. Her story never wavered, and her demeanor remained completely composed. "Ms. Martinez," Detective Rodriguez said, leaning back in his chair, "I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I've never seen anything quite like what happened tonight. 3 grown men, all with previous assault charges, taken down by someone who teaches Shakespeare to teenagers." He studied her face carefully. "That's not exactly normal." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "No, I suppose it's not," she agreed. "But neither is watching someone get harassed and doing nothing about it." She spoke as if her actions were the most natural thing in the world, showing no hint of pride or boastfulness about what she had accomplished. The detective flipped through the witness statements again. "Every person in that coffee shop says the same thing. You moved like you had military training, combat training specifically." He paused, waiting for her response. "Care to explain that?" For the first time that evening, Sarah hesitated. She had hoped to avoid this conversation, but she knew it was inevitable. The skills she had displayed weren't something a civilian would typically possess, and any experienced law enforcement officer would recognize that fact. "I served in the Navy for 12 years, she said finally. "I received extensive training during my service." Her answer was truthful but carefully limited, revealing only what was absolutely necessary. Detective Rodriguez nodded slowly. "What kind of training exactly? And what was your job in the Navy?" He had a feeling there was much more to Sarah's story than she was letting on, and his instincts were rarely wrong. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, weighing her options. Her military service was a matter of public record, but the specific details of her assignments were classified. She had spent years learning to compartmentalize information, to share only what was safe and necessary. "I was part of a special operations unit," she said carefully. "We received advanced combat training as part of our duties." She hoped the vague description would satisfy his curiosity without requiring her to reveal more sensitive information. The detective's eyebrows rose slightly. Special operations meant elite military units. the kind that operated in dangerous situations around the world. Suddenly, the events at the coffee shop made much more sense. "How long have you been teaching?" he asked, changing his approach. Sometimes people were more comfortable talking about their current lives than their military past. 3 years, Sarah replied, visibly relaxing as the conversation shifted to safer ground. "I started at Jefferson High School right after I left the service. I wanted to do something meaningful with my life, something that would make a positive difference." Her voice carried genuine warmth when she spoke about her students. Detective Rodriguez made notes as they talked, but his mind was working on a different level. Special operations personnel didn't just receive advanced combat training. They were among the most highly skilled warriors in the world, capable of handling situations that would terrify ordinary soldiers. "Ms. Martinez, can I ask you something off the record?" The detective leaned forward, his tone becoming more conversational. "Those men tonight, they had weapons. At least one of them did. You could have been killed." He shook his head. "Why didn't you just call for help? Why put yourself at risk like that?" Sarah considered the question seriously. It was something she had asked herself many times since leaving the military. Why couldn't she just walk away from dangerous situations? Why did she feel compelled to intervene when others were in trouble? "I took an oath once," she said slowly, "to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. That oath didn't come with an expiration date." Her words carried the weight of deeply held convictions, beliefs that had been forged through years of service and sacrifice. The detective studied her face and saw something he recognized from other veterans he had encountered. There was a quiet strength there, a confidence born from facing genuine danger and emerging victorious. But there was also something else, something that suggested her military service had involved more than standard combat operations. "The men from tonight are being charged with assault, harassment, and weapons violations," he said, closing his notebook. "Based on the witness statements and the evidence, you acted in clear self-defense. You're free to go." He stood up and extended his hand. "Thank you for what you did tonight. That young woman could have been seriously hurt." Sarah shook his hand and gathered her purse. "I just did what anyone should do in that situation," she said, though both she and the detective knew that wasn't exactly true. Most people wouldn't have possessed the skills or the courage to intervene as she had. As she walked toward the exit, Detective Rodriguez called after her. "Ms. Martinez, if you don't mind me asking, what unit were you with in the Navy?" His question was casual, but his eyes were sharp and attentive. Sarah paused at the door, her hand on the handle. For a moment, she considered telling him the truth. Then she thought about the life she had built, the quiet anonymity she had worked so hard to maintain. "Just a regular Navy unit," she said with a slight smile. "Nothing special." She walked out into the night, leaving the detective with more questions than answers. Back in the interview room, Detective Rodriguez sat alone, staring at the empty chair where Sarah had been sitting. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a Marine, and he knew the look of someone who had seen real combat. But there was something about Sarah Martinez that went beyond ordinary military service. He opened his computer and began typing her name into the military database. The basic information came up immediately. Sarah Elena Martinez, 12 years of Navy service, honorable discharge, exemplary record. But when he tried to access details about her assignments and training, he found himself blocked by security classifications he had never encountered before. "Interesting," he murmured to himself. Whatever Sarah Martinez had done in the Navy, it was important enough to keep secret long after her service had ended. The woman who spent her days teaching literature to high school students had once been something far more dangerous than she was letting on. The next morning at Jefferson High School, news of the coffee shop incident had somehow reached the students before Sarah even arrived. Social media had done its work overnight, and blurry cell phone videos from witnesses were already circulating online. By the time Sarah walked into her first period classroom, whispers followed her down the hallway. "Did you really beat up 3 guys last night, Ms. Martinez?" asked Jake, one of her more outspoken students. The entire class turned to look at their teacher with new eyes, as if seeing her for the first time. Sarah set her bag down at her desk and looked around the room at the eager faces staring back at her. These were the same students she had been teaching for 2 years, but their expressions had changed completely. Where once they had seen just another English teacher, now they saw someone mysterious and powerful. I was involved in an incident last night where I had to defend myself and protect someone else, she said calmly, opening her lesson plan book. But right now we need to focus on your essays about To Kill a Mockingbird. Who wants to share their thoughts about Atticus Finch's moral courage? The students exchanged glances, clearly not ready to move on from the previous night's events. Emma Rodriguez, a shy sophomore who rarely spoke in class, raised her hand tentatively. Ms. Martinez, my mom said you were in the military. Is that true? Emma's question was soft but determined. She had been thinking about it all morning, trying to reconcile the gentle teacher who encouraged her writing with the person who could single-handedly defeat multiple attackers. Sarah paused, her red pen hovering over a stack of papers. She had known this moment would come eventually. Her students were smart and curious, and they deserved honest answers to their questions, even if she couldn't tell them everything. Yes, I served in the Navy for 12 years before I became a teacher, she confirmed. My military experience taught me many things, including the importance of standing up for people who need help. She looked around the room, meeting each student's eyes. But that doesn't change who I am in this classroom or how much I care about your education. Marcus, a football player who usually slept through English class, sat up straighter in his chair. What did you do in the Navy? Were you like a soldier or something? His question reflected the genuine curiosity of someone who had never considered his teacher as anything other than an authority figure with a gradebook. I had various assignments during my service, Sarah replied carefully. The important thing is that my experiences taught me the value of protecting others and standing up for what's right. That's the same message we see in the literature we study together. She turned to the whiteboard and began writing the day's discussion questions, but she could feel the students' continued attention focused on her, rather than the lesson. Their perception of her had fundamentally shifted, and she knew there was no going back to the comfortable anonymity she had enjoyed. During lunch, Principal Williams knocked on Sarah's classroom door. Dr. Janet Williams was a former teacher herself, someone who understood the delicate balance between maintaining authority and connecting with students. Sarah, we need to talk, Dr. Williams said, closing the door behind her. I've been getting calls all morning from parents, reporters, and even the school district office. Everyone wants to know about our hero teacher who single-handedly stopped 3 armed men. She sat down across from Sarah's desk with a concerned expression. Sarah looked up from the paper she was grading. I'm sorry if this has created problems for the school. I never intended for any of this to become public. She genuinely regretted that her past was now affecting her workplace and her students. Don't apologize, Dr. Williams said firmly. What you did was incredibly brave, and I'm proud to have you on our staff. But I need to understand what we're dealing with here. The district is asking questions about your background, and some parents are concerned about having someone with your skills around their children. Sarah had anticipated this conversation as well. She knew that her military background, combined with the previous night's events, would raise questions about her suitability as a teacher. Some people would see her as a protector, while others might view her as a potential threat. Dr. Williams, everything about my military service and background was thoroughly vetted when I was hired, Sarah said. I underwent extensive background checks, psychological evaluations, and character references. My sole focus here is educating students and helping them reach their potential. The principal nodded thoughtfully. I believe that completely, Sarah. You're one of our best teachers and your students adore you. But I need to know if there's anything else about your past that might become an issue. The media attention isn't going away anytime soon. Sarah considered how much she could safely reveal. Her SEAL training and missions were classified, but her general military service was public record. She had to find a way to satisfy legitimate concerns without compromising national security or her own safety. I was part of a Navy Special Operations Unit, she said finally. We received extensive training in combat, weapons, and tactical operations. My discharge was honorable, and I have no criminal record or disciplinary actions in my file. My service record speaks for itself. Dr. Williams leaned back in her chair, processing this information. Special operations meant elite military units, the kind that operated in the most dangerous environments around the world. No wonder Sarah had been able to handle 3 attackers so efficiently. How many of your fellow teachers know about your background? The principal asked. She was already thinking about how to manage the situation, how to protect both Sarah and the school from unwanted attention. Very few, Sarah admitted. I've always preferred to keep my military service private. I wanted to be judged as a teacher, not as a former soldier. She understood the principal's concerns, but she also hoped that her 3 years of excellent performance would count for something. Dr. Williams stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the students in the courtyard below. Sarah, I want you to know that you have my full support. What you did last night showed exactly the kind of character and courage we want in our teachers. But we need to be prepared for the attention this is going to bring. As if on cue, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message, then another, and another. The local news stations had gotten hold of her name and were requesting interviews. The story of the mild-mannered English teacher who was secretly a military combat veteran was exactly the kind of human interest piece that captured public imagination. It looks like our quiet little school is about to become very interesting, Dr. Williams said with a wry smile. Are you ready for this, Sarah? Sarah looked at her phone, watching the interview requests pile up. She thought about the life she had built, the careful anonymity she had maintained, and the students who depended on her. Her past was about to collide with her present in ways she had never anticipated. I suppose I don't have much choice, she said quietly, but whatever happens, my priority remains the same. These students deserve the best education I can give them, regardless of what else is going on in my life. By Friday morning, 3 days after the coffee shop incident, Sarah's life had been turned completely upside down. News vans lined the street in front of Jefferson High School, and reporters thrust microphones toward any student or teacher who was willing to talk about the mystery teacher with military training. Sarah arrived at school early, hoping to avoid the media circus, but she found Detective Rodriguez waiting for her in the parking lot. His expression was serious as he approached her car. Ms. Martinez, we need to talk, he said, glancing around at the news crews setting up their equipment. Somewhere private. His tone suggested this conversation was about more than just following up on the coffee shop incident. They walked into the school through a side entrance, avoiding the reporters gathered at the main doors. Detective Rodriguez followed Sarah to her empty classroom, where she turned on the lights and gestured for him to take a seat. What's this about, Detective? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew. She had been waiting for this moment since their conversation at the police station. Rodriguez pulled out a folder and set it on her desk. I did some checking into your military background after our conversation the other night. What I found was very interesting. He opened the folder to reveal several documents, most of which were heavily redacted with black bars covering crucial information. Sarah glanced at the papers and recognized the familiar format of classified military records. Someone with significant clearance had accessed her file, which meant this conversation was about to become much more serious. According to these records, you weren't just in a regular Navy unit as you told me, Rodriguez continued. You were part of SEAL Team 6, one of the most elite special operations units in the world. You served in Afghanistan, Syria, and several other locations that are still classified. He looked up at her with a mixture of respect and curiosity. Sarah remained silent, her face expressionless. She had spent years learning to control her reactions, to reveal nothing that could compromise operational security. Even though her service had ended, those habits remained deeply ingrained. Ms. Martinez, you were part of operations that saved countless lives, the detective continued. According to what I can read in these files, you were decorated multiple times for valor under fire. You're not just a former soldier. You're a legitimate war hero. For the first time in the conversation, Sarah showed a reaction. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly unhappy with the direction the discussion was taking. Detective Rodriguez, I appreciate your curiosity, but that part of my life is over, she said firmly. I'm a teacher now. That's all that matters. Her voice carried a finality that suggested she considered the topic closed. But Rodriguez wasn't finished. The reason I'm here is that your former commanding officer called me yesterday. Captain James Mitchell? He said he's been following the news coverage and wanted to make sure you were all right. He watched Sarah's reaction carefully. He also said some things about your service that I think you need to hear. Sarah's composure cracked slightly at the mention of Captain Mitchell. She hadn't spoken to him since her discharge 3 years ago, but he had been more than just her commanding officer. He had been a mentor, someone who understood the unique challenges of transitioning from special operations to civilian life. What did he say? She asked quietly. her professional mask slipping to reveal genuine concern. Rodriguez consulted his notes. He said you were one of the best operators he ever commanded, but he also said you left the service because you were struggling with the transition back to normal life. After your last mission, he's worried that the media attention might bring back some difficult memories. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the news vans in the parking lot. Her last mission had indeed been difficult, a hostage rescue operation that had gone wrong in ways that still haunted her dreams. The decision to leave the military hadn't been easy, but she had known it was necessary for her mental health. Captain Mitchell always worried too much, she said finally, but her voice lacked conviction. I'm fine, Detective. I've built a good life here, and I'm helping my students learn and grow. That's enough for me. Rodriguez stood up and gathered his papers. Ms. Martinez, I hope you know that what you did the other night was exactly what this community needed. You showed people that there are still heroes willing to stand up and protect others. He paused at the door. But if you ever need someone to talk to, someone who understands what military service can do to a person, my card has my personal number on it. After he left, Sarah sat alone in her classroom, watching the morning sunlight stream through the windows. In a few minutes, her students would arrive, eager to discuss the latest developments in the media coverage of their famous teacher. She would have to find a way to maintain her composure and focus on education, while her carefully constructed private life crumbled around her. Her phone buzzed with another text message. This one was from Captain Mitchell himself. Saw the news. Proud of you, but worried too. Call me when you can. You don't have to face this alone. Sarah stared at the message for a long time. Part of her wanted to call him immediately, to reconnect with someone who understood the weight of the secret she carried. But another part of her feared that talking to him would only remind her of everything she had tried to leave behind. The classroom door opened, and Emma, the shy sophomore from her second period class, peeked inside. Ms. Martinez, are you okay? You look sad. The girl's genuine concern was exactly what Sarah needed to refocus on what mattered most. I'm fine, Emma, Sarah said, forcing a smile, just thinking about lesson plans. Are you ready for our discussion about moral courage today? She pushed her personal concerns aside and prepared to do what she did best, teach young minds to think critically about the world around them. As more students filed into the classroom, chattering excitedly about seeing their teacher on the morning news, Sarah realized that her two worlds were about to collide in ways she had never imagined. The question was whether she could protect her students and her new life, while dealing with the consequences of her heroic past. 2 weeks after the coffee shop incident, Sarah had finally found a rhythm that balanced her newfound notoriety with her commitment to teaching. The media attention had died down somewhat, though she still received occasional interview requests and fan mail from people who had heard her story. She was grading papers in her classroom after school when Emma from the coffee shop appeared in her doorway. The young barista looked nervous but determined as she clutched a handwritten letter in her trembling hands. Ms. Martinez, I hope it's okay that I came here, Emma said softly. I wanted to thank you properly for what you did that night. I've been having nightmares about what might have happened if you hadn't been there. Tears started forming in her eyes as she remembered the fear she had felt. Sarah set down her red pen and walked over to the girl. Emma, you don't need to thank me. I just did what anyone should have done in that situation. She guided the teenager to a chair near her desk, recognizing the signs of someone still processing a traumatic experience. But that's not true, Emma insisted, wiping her eyes with a tissue. All those other people in the coffee shop just sat there and watched. Only you cared enough to help me. She handed Sarah the letter with shaking hands. I wrote this to tell you how much it meant to me. Sarah accepted the letter but didn't open it immediately. Instead, she sat down across from Emma and really looked at her. The girl was young, maybe 19 or 20, probably working her way through college like so many students Sarah had taught over the years. Emma, can I ask you something? Sarah said gently. How are you doing now? Are you getting any help dealing with what happened? She had seen enough trauma in her military service to recognize when someone needed support. The girl nodded slowly. I started seeing a counselor at the community college. She's helping me work through the anxiety and the fear. Emma paused, gathering her courage. But she also said I should tell you something important. Those men, they had been coming to the coffee shop for weeks, bothering female customers and employees. Sarah's expression grew serious. What do you mean? They had a pattern, Emma explained. They would target young women who were alone, intimidate them, sometimes follow them to their cars. The manager knew about it, but he was scared to do anything because they threatened him too. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. You didn't just save me that night, Ms. Martinez. You stopped them from hurting other people. This revelation hit Sarah harder than she expected. She had thought she was simply intervening in an isolated incident, but apparently the situation had been much more serious than she realized. Emma, have the police been told about this pattern of behavior? Sarah asked, her military training automatically shifting her into tactical thinking mode. Yes, Detective Rodriguez interviewed several other victims after our incident made the news. It turns out these men had been harassing women all over the city for months. Emma's voice carried a note of satisfaction. They're being charged with multiple counts of stalking and harassment now thanks to what you did. Sarah sat back in her chair, processing this information. Her split-second decision to intervene had apparently disrupted a much larger pattern of predatory behavior. Sometimes, she reflected, the most important battles were fought in coffee shops rather than foreign battlefields. There's something else, Emma continued, reaching into her backpack. Detective Rodriguez asked me to give you this. We handed Sarah an official-looking envelope with the police department's seal. Sarah opened the envelope and found a letter of commendation from the chief of police, formally recognizing her actions as an example of outstanding citizenship and civic courage. There was also a note from Detective Rodriguez explaining that her intervention had led to the identification and arrest of the harassment ring. Ms. Martinez, Emma said, standing up to leave. I know you don't like being called a hero, but that's what you are, not because of whatever you did in the military, but because you saw someone who needed help and you acted. That takes a special kind of person. After Emma left, Sarah sat alone in her classroom, thinking about the unexpected ways her past and present had intersected. She had spent 3 years trying to build a quiet, normal life as a teacher, but one moment of crisis had revealed that she could never completely escape who she had been trained to be. Her phone rang, and she was surprised to see Captain Mitchell's name on the screen. She had been avoiding his calls for 2 weeks, but something about Emma's visit made her feel ready to talk. Hello, Captain, she said, answering on the third ring. Sarah. Finally. His familiar voice carried relief and concern in equal measure. I've been worried about you. How are you holding up with all this attention? Sarah found herself smiling for the first time in days. I'm managing, sir. It's been an adjustment, but my students are keeping me grounded. She looked around her classroom, filled with evidence of the lives she was helping to shape. How did you hear about what happened? Are you kidding? The story of a former SEAL who became a high school teacher and single-handedly stopped 3 attackers? That's been circulating through every military network I know. Captain Mitchell's pride was evident in his voice. Sarah, you should know that what you did that night reminded a lot of people why they served in the first place. They talked for nearly an hour, catching up on mutual friends and discussing the challenges of civilian life. Captain Mitchell shared news about other team members who had successfully transitioned to civilian careers. And Sarah found herself feeling more connected to her military family than she had in years. Sarah, I want you to know something, Captain Mitchell said as their conversation wound down. The skills we taught you, the training you received, it wasn't just for military operations. It was to prepare you to protect people and stand up for what's right, wherever life takes you. What you did in that coffee shop was exactly what we hoped our training would accomplish. After ending the call, Sarah sat in the quiet classroom as the sun set outside her windows. She thought about the students who would return on Monday, eager to learn and grow. She thought about Emma, who was learning to overcome her trauma with professional help. She thought about the other women who were now safe because 3 predators had been stopped. For the first time since the incident, Sarah felt truly at peace with what had happened. She hadn't asked for the media attention or the disruption to her quiet life, but she had done exactly what her training and her values had prepared her to do. She had protected someone who couldn't protect herself, and in doing so, she had prevented other innocent people from becoming victims. The next Monday morning, Sarah walked into Jefferson High School with renewed confidence. The reporters were gone, the excitement had died down, and her students were ready to focus on education again. But something fundamental had changed. Her students no longer saw her as just another teacher. And she no longer saw herself as someone trying to hide from her past. She was Sarah Martinez, former Navy SEAL and current high school English teacher. Both parts of her identity were important, and both contributed to her ability to shape young minds and protect her community. Some people might find that combination unusual, but Sarah had learned that the most meaningful life was one where all aspects of your experience could be used to help others. As she wrote the day's lesson objectives on the whiteboard, Sarah smiled at the thought that her students would never know how much their presence had helped her heal from her own struggles. Teaching them had given her purpose and peace, while her military experience had given her the tools to protect them and others when necessary. It was, she realized, exactly the life she was meant to live.